happened in Des Moines, Iowa, on a cold January night in 1982. Under the sterile glare of stage lights and the roar of 20,000 screaming fans, Ozzy Osbourne stood with his arms outstretched, messiah or madman. No one could say for sure. A bat arced through the air, thrown from the crowd like a morbid offering. Ozzy caught it. He thought it was rubber. It wasn't. When he sank his teeth into its neck, the crowd convulsed, half in shock, half in ecstasy. There was a pop, a wetness, and then a stillness. The bat didn't scream. It didn't even twitch. Ozzy spat it out as blood dripped from his lips. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was real, and something had just crossed a line. Later, in the ER, as doctors injected rabies vaccines into his stomach, Ozzy barely blinked. To him, this was routine. A man whose life had long stopped obeying the laws of logic or mortality. But this was only one scene in a larger symphony of near deaths, breakdowns, and resurrections. A pattern had emerged time and time again. Ozzy Osbourne should have died, but didn't. As if the Reaper approached and then paused, confused. There's something unsettling about those who survive what should kill them. It upends the rules. When Ozzy bit that bat, he became something else, not quite monster, not quite prophet. He became a riddle in human form, wrapped in leather and eyeliner. Long before that night, the darkness had already chosen him. And long after the applause died down, it would linger silently watching, waiting. He would forget that bat eventually, but it would not forget him. It would return in interviews, in memes, in myths whispered by fans and mocked by skeptics. It became the first line in a longer obituary that was never written. In folklore, the bat is a symbol of transition, a creature that bridges light and dark, death and rebirth. For Ozzy, it became a totem of his entire existence. The moment he bit it, something bit back. His bandmates laughed. The media spiraled. But Sharon, his wife, didn't laugh. "He's going to die," she said quietly, as she watched her husband unravel backstage, numb, blank-eyed, his hands shaking from something deeper than adrenaline. There are people who seem immune to death not because they are strong, but because they are already half there. Ozzy didn't fear what waited on the other side. He just didn't recognize the edge when he stood on it. And perhaps that's why death kept retreating. Each time a little slower, a little more intrigued. Somewhere in that arena, a fan claimed the bat's wing. Others claimed they saw his eyes turn black. But the truth, as always, lies in the space between myth and memory. That night, the Prince of Darkness didn't die. He did something far stranger. He lived. Before the bats and blood and headlines, there was only John Michael Osbourne, a pale, wiry boy, growing up in the soot-stained brick corridors of Aston, a working-class district in Birmingham, England. It was a place where fog didn't rise. It seeped through windows, under doors, into lungs. The air carried the weight of iron, of silent fathers, of factory hours stamped into bone. Ozzy was the fourth of 6 children, crammed into a small house with thin walls and thick silences. His father worked nights at a tool factory. His mother stacked car parts. There was food, but not always warmth. Laughter, but never lightness. Childhood felt like a dim hallway he wandered through, knocking into walls. From an early age, he heard things. Voices that weren't quite voices. Not hallucinations. Not ghosts, just flickers of presence in empty rooms. He would sit for hours in corners, head tilted, listening. Later, he'd describe these moments as the beginning of his music sounds behind the veil. School was a torment. He was mocked for his stutter, his unsteady hands, his far-off stare. Teachers dismissed him as dull, unteachable, not right in the head. They muttered. But inside, Something was flickering, something raw and ancient and waiting. He didn't understand it, only that the world outside seemed muffled, like a television behind a closed door. Then came the Beatles. The moment he heard She Loves You on the radio, the colors in his head snapped into focus. "I want to be that," he said. Not the Beatles, exactly, but heard, seen, known, not ignored or explained away. He began singing in the bathroom, using the acoustics of tile and mirror to shape his voice into something haunting. Neighbors complained. His father rolled his eyes. But he kept going, singing in empty lots, under bridges, late at night in cemeteries near home. There was something about graveyards that soothed him. The silence felt familiar. His first job was as a plumber's apprentice, then a car horn tester, then a slaughterhouse assistant. It was there, surrounded by the smell of blood and steam, that he said he first truly understood death. "You look into the eyes of a cow that knows it's next," he once whispered, "and something inside you goes still." He didn't last long. The killing floor was too much, or maybe too honest. At 17, he was arrested for burglary. He'd broken into a clothes shop and left his fingerprints on a pair of gloves he hadn't stolen because he couldn't afford to. He spent weeks in Winson Green prison. It was the first time he slept in darkness without anyone shouting. But prison didn't scare him. Nothing did. Really. What frightened him wasn't the world, but how distant he felt from it. Like he'd been born through a crack in reality, only half tethered to this life. By the time he joined a band called Earth, which would soon become Black Sabbath, he already carried a kind of myth in his bones. Bandmates noticed it. He never wrote songs, exactly. He channeled them. Sounds, images, fragments often about death, fire, blindness, and war. He didn't understand where they came from. "It's like my mouth's moving before I know what I'm saying." Back then, they weren't trying to be dark. Darkness was simply all they knew. There's a photograph of Ozzy at 19 leaning against a cemetery gate, smoke curling from his lips, eyes blank as if lost in another frequency. Behind him, rows of headstones lean like frozen choir singers. The fog blurs the sky. He doesn't smile. In the margins of ordinary life, some children grow into shadows before they become men. Ozzy didn't walk into fame. He wandered into it, like a ghost trying to remember who he was before he died. It was never just about the music, not really. When Black Sabbath recorded their debut album in a single 12-hour session in 1969, the world didn't know what it was hearing. Guitars that groaned like iron gates, drums that struck like ritual thunder, and over it all, Ozzy's voice, high, trembling, urgent. It didn't sing. It warned. Critics didn't understand. They called it noise, evil, delinquent. But the kids, the kids they knew. They felt the shadow in his words and recognized something ancient waking up. Something no top 40 chart could explain. Sabbath wasn't rebellion. It was revelation. Ozzy said the voice came from nowhere. He'd open his mouth, and it would pour out raw, desperate, sometimes in languages he didn't recognize. When the others played their riffs, he didn't need lyrics. "The music tells me what to say," he once muttered in a backstage corridor, cigarette shaking in his fingers. But the voice wasn't always his. Sometimes, it felt borrowed. Sharon would later recall seeing him sitting alone backstage, head bowed, whispering into his palms like a monk in penance. No one around, no phone, just a conversation with something unseen. When asked, he'd shrug and say, "I hear things sometimes. Doesn't everyone?" The band embraced it. They leaned into the occult, pentagrams, goats, and funeral bells weren't gimmicks. They were artifacts of their upbringing. Churchyards, air raids, hollow-eyed neighbors with stories they never told. Ozzy wasn't inventing darkness. He was remembering it. But with each album, The lines between performance and possession began to blur. He started waking up in unfamiliar cities. Whole nights vanished. Once, in Detroit. He was found asleep in a stranger's hotel room, curled up beneath a table, murmuring lyrics to a song he hadn't written yet. The others were disturbed, but fascinated. There was always this current around him, guitarist Tony Iommi once said, like static in the air. You felt it when he entered a room. He carried something, and then there was the blood. During one concert in Hamburg, Ozzy sliced his palm open on a broken mic stand. He didn't notice. He sang through the pain, hands outstretched, blood dripping onto the stage like a ritual. Fans screamed, some wept. One fainted. Ozzy, later told, simply blinked and said, "Wasn't that part of the show?" He was drinking more by then. A bottle of brandy before shows. LSD tabs slipped under the tongue between rehearsals. Coke lines across hotel Bibles. But the voice never faltered. It only grew sharper, higher, like something inside him was learning to use him better. In interviews, he spoke of the edge, a place he went to when the music was right, when the crowd was wild and his mind blanked. There's this black place. You know, he said once to a Dutch journalist, and when I'm there, I don't feel sick. I don't feel drunk. I just feel real. He began dreaming in symbols, red clocks with no hands, dogs with human eyes, a woman who whispered lyrics into his ears while sewing her mouth shut. No one around him questioned it. Ozzy was Ozzy, a walking paradox, a broken instrument that still played the most haunted tune. They didn't ask how he functioned. They just kept him moving. But Sharon knew. She saw the tremors when he thought no one was looking. The way his fingers twitched when the air went quiet. The way he sometimes stared at mirrors for too long. In the green room of a show in Copenhagen, she found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, humming a melody that hadn't been written yet. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. He opened his eyes. "Listening," he said. "To what? To the thing that sings through me." For some artists, the muse is a blessing. For Ozzy, it was a visitor who never left. A voice from somewhere just beyond the veil, always whispering, always hungry. By the late 1970s, Ozzy Osbourne's body had become a theater of chemical warfare. Each breath was a cocktail of pills, alcohol, and whatever powder he'd swept off the nearest hotel table. He was no longer riding the wave of fame, he was drowning in it. Head first, eyes wide open. Yet he lived. Every morning brought a hangover that would flatten most men. Every night, a performance that tore through his throat like glass. And still, he rose again. Something was keeping him animated. It wasn't willpower. It wasn't health. Ozzy himself didn't know what it was. "I should be dead," he muttered often. "But I keep waking up." His bandmates grew wary. Sessions with Black Sabbath became chaotic, incoherent. He would disappear for days, reappear with no memory. Stained shirt, torn jeans, eyes black-ringed and shining. One day in Los Angeles, he was found asleep in a hotel flower bed, face down, sunburned and murmuring in Latin. He was fired from Sabbath in 1979. Everyone thought it would kill him. Instead, it freed him, or unshackled whatever was living inside him. That same year, he formed a solo band. Sharon, daughter of Sabbath's manager, took over his life, not just professionally. She became his handler, his caretaker, his cage. He called her the only person who can find me when I go too far. And too far was Ozzy's default setting. During the first solo tour, he was caught urinating on the Alamo dressed in Sharon's nightgown, clutching a bottle of Courvoisier. He laughed about it later, but it wasn't funny. He had blacked out again. When told of his actions, he cried. "It's like I'm not there when it happens." The blood returned, not on stage this time, but on walls, on sheets, on the inside of his mouth. He began waking up with nosebleeds, split lips, bruises he didn't remember earning. Once, Sharon walked into a hotel bathroom and found him drawing symbols on the tiles with what looked like dried blood and eyeliner. He didn't turn around. "I was writing lyrics," he said softly. "But you weren't holding a pen. Doctors prescribed more pills, uppers to function, downers to sleep, tranquilizers for the screams that sometimes woke him at night. No one spoke of demons, but they all felt them in the room." Ozzy started referring to himself in the third person. "Ozzy does that," he'd say, shrugging after an outburst. "What about you?" a journalist once asked. "I don't know who I am," he said, and meant it. And yet, amid all of this, he created. Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman weren't just albums. They were exorcisms. Tracks like Suicide Solution and Revelation Mother Earth didn't come from a songwriter. They sounded like dispatches from a haunted mind. On tour, he collapsed twice. Once from dehydration, once from an overdose. Paramedics said he was clinically dead for several seconds. Sharon said his pulse returned after she screamed his name into his mouth. "It wasn't breath," she said. "It was something colder than that." But it came back. Band members came and went. Some refused to tour with him, afraid, not of violence, but of being too close when the inevitable happened, when death finally arrived. But it didn't. Time after time, Ozzy passed through thresholds where others never returned. Hendrix, Morrison, Joplin, Bonham, Moon, all gone. Yet Ozzy stumbled on, blinking through a fog they never left. Was it luck? Was it punishment? In quiet moments, he began asking himself the same question. Why me? He'd sit on tour buses staring into the night, watching the shadows on the roadside trees shift like old gods. He began to suspect that survival wasn't mercy. It was debt, and the bill hadn't come due. Not yet. The crash should have killed him. Everyone said so. It was December 2003 on the grounds of his Buckinghamshire estate. The sky was colorless, smeared in that peculiar gray only an English winter knows how to paint. Ozzy was alone, riding a four-wheeled ATV, a machine far too powerful for someone whose body had already been torn and rebuilt a dozen times. He accelerated through the trees fast, reckless, maybe trying to outrun something he couldn't name. Then came the silence, a bone-sickening silence. The ATV flipped. The weight of the machine crushed his chest. Ribs shattered. Vertebrae snapped. His collarbone exploded like a dried twig. Lungs collapsed. Blood filled the hollows of his throat. For over half an hour, Ozzy lay unconscious in the cold mud, his body twisted, his skin growing pale under a sheet of chemical rain. Not a cinematic storm, just a slow, spiteful drizzle like the sky leaking sorrow. Sharon was in the house. The staff found him first. Paramedics called it a miracle. Surgeons worked for hours, inserting metal rods, draining fluid, stabilizing the unsalvageable. If he were anyone else, one whispered in the hall, he'd be dead. 10 times over. But he wasn't anyone else. He was Ozzy when he awoke. Days later, the room was dim. Machines hissed. A single television flickered on the far wall, left on by a nurse who didn't believe he'd survive the night. His eyes fluttered open, and through a morphine haze, he saw a face at the foot of his bed. His father's face. Jack Osbourne had died years before, but Ozzy swore then and now that he was there that night. He didn't say anything. Ozzy whispered later, just stood there, looking sad, as if he knew I wasn't ready. They argued. Ozzy said, not in words, in some deeper language, not about death, but about why he couldn't cross over yet. Was it guilt? Was it music? Was it punishment? When he tried to explain it to Sharon, she touched his hand gently and said, "You came back." "No," he muttered. "I was sent back. Recovery was slow." His bones healed, but his mind didn't. He began forgetting names, faces. He spoke in riddles. One morning, he asked his nurse what day it was. She answered. He smiled faintly and replied, "I was there that day, but not in this world." Sharon stayed by his side, reading to him, playing old Sabbath records, reminding him that he was still Ozzy Osbourne. But the man in the bed wasn't sure. He felt like a replica, a patched-together echo of someone who had already gone once and hadn't quite made it all the way back. And there was something else. He began to write again. Lyrics scribbled in notebooks with shaking hands. Themes of rain, silence, apology. One line, repeated in various forms across pages. Stood out. I argued with death, and it left me here, outside the hospital. Fans gathered. They left candles, photos, letters. Some said prayers. Some whispered curses. Some simply stood in the rain, as if waiting for news from the underworld. They didn't know how close Ozzy had come, or how often he'd been there before. By the time he returned to public life, his body bore new scars. Metal rods in his spine, a tremor in his left hand, a hesitation in his voice. But the darkness hadn't receded. It had changed shape, and perhaps, just perhaps so had he. From that day on, Ozzy began referring to the accident not as a tragedy, but as a moment of judgment, a checkpoint between life and something else. Not hell, not heaven, just the place where your name is read aloud, and you find out if you're done. He wasn't, not yet. It was 1989 in the calm before another tour, when Ozzy almost became a killer. The scene was not a stage, not a bar, not even one of his usual blackouts on the road. It was home, quiet, insulated, supposedly safe. And then everything went silent, horrifyingly silent. That night, Sharon found herself face to face with a version of Ozzy she didn't recognize. His eyes were glassed over, unblinking, his breath shallow, his hands, once soft from years of microphone grips and tremors, now firm, gripping her throat. The argument had been nothing, a passing remark, a misunderstood glance, the kind of thing married couples shrug off over tea the next day. But something in Ozzy snapped or slipped. He later said he felt like he was outside himself, floating, watching from the ceiling as someone wearing his skin did something unspeakable. Sharon struggled. Her breath cut short beneath the weight of her husband, her star, her burden, her miracle of destruction. She reached out, fingers clawing against the couch cushions. Ozzy's face was eerily calm, not angry, not blank, serene. And then he spoke. One line. "We've come to a decision. It wasn't I. It was we. To this day." Sharon doesn't know what he meant. She doesn't ask anymore. She just remembers the grip, the heat, and the sudden blur of consciousness slipping through her fingers. Then darkness, and then shouting. The housekeeper burst in, pulled Ozzy off. Police, sirens, static. Ozzy was arrested, charged with attempted murder. Photographers caught him being led away in cuffs, his expression dazed, like a sleepwalker waking up mid-staircase. Sharon did not press charges. She bailed him out. The tabloids tore it apart. Ozzy attacks wife. Prince of Darkness turns on Queen. But behind the screaming headlines was something more disturbing. Ozzy had no memory of the incident. Nothing. A full blackout. Gone. The entire evening, erased like a corrupted cassette. When asked why she didn't leave him, Sharon whispered, "Because it wasn't him." Instead, she sent him to rehab. Again, Ozzy complied. Again, he entered the clinic like a ghost. Not defiant, not reluctant, just absent. Doctors said he was lucky to be alive, let alone standing. His bloodstream was a pharmacy, his liver, a battleground, his mind, flooded with residues no machine could measure. One therapist, after months of sessions, told Sharon. There are moments when he's not there, when someone or something else is answering for him at night. Ozzy began having dreams again. He spoke in his sleep, sometimes in gibberish, sometimes in what sounded like German, though he never learned the language. Once, he murmured, "Forgive me for what we almost did." Sharon heard it. She didn't wake him. For a time, things improved. Ozzy stayed clean, or cleaner. He apologized, though he couldn't remember what for. He wrote love letters, clumsy and beautiful. He bought her a white dog and named it Mercy. But the tremble in his hands never left, nor did the shadows in his eyes. During a later interview, when asked what he feared most, Ozzy didn't mention death or drugs or even losing Sharon. He said, simply losing track of who's talking inside. He laughed after, but it was hollow. There are moments in life when a person splits not physically, but spiritually. Moments where a self fractures and lets something else in. Some call it trauma, others call it possession. Ozzy never called it anything. He just carried it, like a scar no one could see. The incident with the pillow became another buried chapter, not erased, but archived, stored away in the attic of his mind, where bats hang upside down and whisper old songs through the rafters. He would survive this, too. But something in Sharon died that night. Not her love. That remained, fiercely. But her belief that this man, her man, was still whole, still held together by one mind, one voice. That belief never came back. Years later, when the dust of tour buses settled and the screaming faded into polite interviews, scientists came calling not to praise Ozzy's music, but to study his blood. In 2010, a team of geneticists conducted what was, at the time, one of the most extensive genome mappings of a living celebrity. Their subject, a man who had consumed enough drugs and alcohol to kill several grown elephants, yet remained against logic, medicine, and probability alive. What they found was not normal. Ozzy's DNA revealed mutations no one had seen before. Not just quirks changes, rare genetic variations linked to metabolism, especially of opiates and barbiturates. Essentially, his body had adapted over time into a kind of biochemical fortress, a living filtration system, a vessel built not to thrive, but to endure. Bill Sullivan, one of the scientists involved, would later say, "Ozzy is the only person I've ever sequenced with this level of mutation in the ADH4 gene. That's the alcohol dehydrogenase gene. His body doesn't break substances down the way ours do. It absorbs them, rewrites them." Ozzy laughed when they told him. "They should bottle my blood and sell it as a party drug," he said. But beneath the laughter, something stirred. For decades, he had viewed his survival as chaotic grace or perhaps divine irony. Now, he was told it might simply be chemistry. Was it comforting or terrifying? The idea that he might be built for suffering. That some code written in him before music, before trauma, before Sharon, before the bat had predetermined a life of excess without consequence. A man designed not to flourish, but to withstand decay. It echoed something he had said years before, half joking, fully broken. "I'm not living, I'm being preserved." But genes are only part of a person. They cannot explain the voices, the blank spaces, the dreams that never aged. They cannot explain why Ozzy once stood at the window of a hotel in Buenos Aires, convinced he saw a younger version of himself watching from the alley. They cannot explain why mirrors in his house began to disturb him. "It's like someone else is behind them," he told Sharon one morning. "Not me. Someone wearing my face." She ordered the mirrors removed. The public embraced the genetic news with morbid fascination. Articles dubbed him the immortal rocker, genetic anomaly, biological miracle. But Ozzy didn't feel like a miracle. He felt like a specimen, an artifact of some failed experiment that hadn't ended yet. During a follow-up medical evaluation, a doctor jokingly asked what he planned to do with his gift. Ozzy stared at him. "Survive," he said flatly, "because dying's not working." He began having dreams again, only this time, not of stage lights or crowds, but of cold glass tubes, of whispers in fluorescent corridors, of being dissected, bit by bit, until nothing remained but the voice, always the voice. He once said to his son, Jack, "Maybe God didn't curse me. Maybe he couldn't kill me, so he locked me here." There was silence after that. No one knew what to say. In Greek myth, Prometheus stole fire and was punished by being chained, his liver eaten daily by vultures regenerating each night, cursed to endure pain without release. Ozzy's punishment, it seemed, was similar, except the vultures wore lab coats. The truth, he didn't want to be immortal. He just didn't know how to be mortal anymore. And so, the man with the shredded voice and trembling hands kept going, kept breathing, kept waking up in a world where everyone else who lived like he did was long buried. He kept wondering, what exactly am I surviving for? But there was no answer, only the next sunrise, and the mirror he refused to look into. The announcement came in January 2020. Ozzy Osbourne, now aged 71, revealed that he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a degenerative disorder of the central nervous system, slow and merciless in its erasure of motion, memory, and identity. It was, in some ways, the first time he publicly acknowledged that something had finally caught up to him. But those close to him knew the shaking had started long before the press conferences and concerned headlines, long before the carefully chosen words about mild symptoms and manageable stages. Sharon had seen it in his fingers. Years prior, a persistent tremble, a hesitation when reaching for a glass, a sudden loss of balance on stage, masked by bravado. Ozzy called it nerves, but nerves don't whisper to you in your sleep. At night, his dreams began to decay, not disappear, rot. Images would begin clearly, then melt. Sharon's face would turn to wax. Familiar rooms would fill with shadows. Sometimes, he'd wake up and not know where he was. He'd reach for his microphone in the middle of the night, only to find a rosary in his hand, one he didn't remember placing there. The nodding became constant, subtle, rhythmic, as though he was always responding to someone in the room. But no one was there. "I'm talking to myself more these days," he said once to a friend. Then, after a pause, "Except sometimes, I'm not the one answering." Doctors pointed to dopamine depletion, neural misfires, reasonable explanations, rooted in neurology. But those around him, the ones who had heard his stories, really heard them, sensed something stranger, as if the disease were not invading, but awakening something that had always slept in his spine. His voice, too, began to falter. Not vanish, but distort. Some days, it rasped like broken tape. Other days, it came back with a crispness that seemed borrowed from another decade. Fans blamed age, Ozzy blamed time. He once sat by his fireplace, staring at the embers like they might form an answer. "You know what Parkinson's really is," he whispered. "It's time peeling you apart. Not killing you, dissecting you." The tremors grew worse. On stage, he stood less, sat more. He still sang, still growled, but something in his posture looked suspended, like a marionette waiting for the next tug. And yet, he still smiled, still cracked jokes, still flipped the devil horns to adoring crowds. But in quieter moments, his eyes betrayed him. They wandered, they listened, as if the illness gave him a clearer channel to whatever had always followed him beneath the fame, beneath the addiction, beneath even the music. Sharon once asked if he feared losing his memory. He replied, "No, I fear remembering everything." He began writing again, not songs, but fragments. Short verses scribbled on napkins, backs of receipts, edges of pill bottles. Most made no sense, but some were chillingly coherent. One read, "The voice and I are parting ways. It wants to go home. I don't know where that is. There's a cruel elegance in diseases like Parkinson's. They do not burn. They do not crash. They erode. A slow unspooling of everything a person once claimed as self." And for someone like Ozzy, whose life had already been an ever-shifting kaleidoscope of blurred timelines, altered states, and haunted silences, this kind of unraveling felt familiar, as if he had always known it would come, as if it were the final chapter of a story whispered to him long ago. He didn't fight it. Not exactly. He endured it, like he always had, like he had been made to. When asked in a rare interview if he felt cursed, he chuckled through cracked teeth and said, "Curse nah. Curses end. This just keeps going." And the interviewer, though trained to smile, couldn't shake the feeling that those words were not just metaphor. They were a truth plain, trembling, and waiting. The house in Beverly Hills was quiet, but not silent. At night, something always moved. Sometimes it was the creak of a window frame. Sometimes the rustle of wind in the tall trees outside, where black crows had begun to gather in unusual numbers. Sometimes it was Ozzy himself wandering the halls, bare feet on cold marble, mumbling songs he hadn't written yet. In the daytime, he was lucid, playful, charming, even. He could still joke with Jack, nod along with Sharon, sign autographs. But once the sun went down, the house seemed to shift. The rooms stretched. The mirrors tilted. Ozzy became still, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. He spoke often of his father. Jack Osbourne had been dead for decades. But lately, Ozzy claimed he visited often in dreams, in reflections, sometimes just in the way a light bulb flickered at the end of a hallway. "He stands in the kitchen," Ozzy said, matter-of-factly. "Same coat he always wore. Smells like oil and soap. But he doesn't look at me anymore. He looks past me." He also spoke of the crows. "They know something," he muttered once to Sharon, standing by the kitchen window. "They used to fly over. Now they watch." When asked what they were watching for, he simply whispered, "Me." The staff dismissed it as medication. Sharon didn't, because she'd seen him waking from dreams drenched in sweat, clawing at his neck, whispering apologies to people long dead. She'd seen him place coins on the windowsills, a habit he'd never explained. She'd found the shoebox under the bed, filled with old photographs, most of them unmarked, faded, some burned at the edges. One night, Jack found Ozzy in the garage, alone in his old tour van. The engine wasn't running. The lights were off. Ozzy was sitting in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, staring forward. When Jack opened the door, his father didn't turn. He only said, "I forgot where I was going." There were no drugs in his system that night, no alcohol, just the echo of something ancient rustling inside him. His notebook's X2 began to change. The scribbled verses were more fragmented, looping back into themselves. Themes emerged: rivers with no end, clocks with no hands, a room of locked doors. One entry, written in a surprisingly steady hand, simply read, "I keep hearing the song backwards. It doesn't end, it starts over." In interviews, he began to speak more abstractly, about time, about the weight of memory, about the way fame distorts not just public perception, but the self. "I've been me so long," he said once. "I don't know who that is anymore." But perhaps the most chilling change was his sudden clarity, brief flashes of razor-sharp insight that cut through the fog like a blade. During a rare televised conversation, the host asked, "What would you say to your younger self if you could go back?" Ozzy paused. The audience waited. Then he looked directly into the camera, his voice almost a whisper. "I'd tell him it's not really over when it's over. The host smiled nervously. Ozzy did not, in the backyard. The crows gathered more often. Sharon took notice. She installed motion detectors. Lights. Nothing scared them off. They watched, heads tilted, black eyes unblinking. Ozzy stopped going outside. He said the air felt different. "You ever feel like your own life is haunting you?" he asked Sharon one night. She didn't know how to answer, so she said nothing, and the silence filled the space between them. As the years pressed in, it became clear that death, for Ozzy, was not an ending. It was a place he kept circling, seeing its contours, hearing its tune, smelling its breath, but never crossing into. And perhaps the reason wasn't fear. Perhaps it was recognition that in some small, uncanny way, he had already been there. It is a strange thing to outlive your own era. By 2024, Ozzy Osbourne had become less a man and more a myth. His body frail, hands trembling, speech slowed, but his presence still vast, unyielding, echoing louder than the silence left by those who had already gone. Keith Moon, Lemmy, Ronnie James Dio, David Bowie, even Taylor Hawkins, gone too soon. The stage, once crowded with legends, now stood like an empty cathedral, each echo a memory, and in the center of it all, Ozzy, shuffling, singing, sometimes whispering, but still here. Fans kept waiting for the obituary. Journalists pre-wrote tributes. Memorial documentaries sat on shelves, and yet he rose each morning, fed his dogs, sipped weak tea, and whispered to the birds outside his window. "I think they're whispering back," he once told Jack, but in reverse. There was no tour now, no new album. But Ozzy somehow kept creating. Scribbled lyrics filled entire drawers, concepts for music videos he'd never shoot, fragments of songs he could only hum, shaky and soft, like lullabies sung by ghosts. One composition stood out, titled simply Still. It was never finished. Sharon once found him sitting alone at the piano, not playing, just resting his fingers on the keys, as though waiting for them to move on their own. When she asked what he was doing, he said, "Listening for the last note. I think it's been playing this whole time." He had stopped questioning why he survived, stopped fearing death. He began to regard it with a kind of familiarity. Not an enemy, not even a friend, but something inevitable and oddly patient, like a train that always stops, but never opens its doors. Some days, he sat by the window and watched old videos of himself. Black Sabbath in '73, the solo tour in '84, the MTV days, the reality show Chaos, the stage dives, the screams, the eyeliner. He would laugh, then pause, then whisper, "Who the hell was that?" Because the man in those tapes felt like someone else. Not an imposter, just another life, another consciousness, another skin. Now shed, he began sleeping more, dreaming deeper. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night and speak aloud, as if continuing a conversation that hadn't paused. "Yes," he'd say. Or, "I remember that too." Or simply "not yet." The crows had stopped coming. In their place, robins appeared, blue jays, gentle birds, as if the sky had begun to forgive him. Sharon noticed. You see that she asked him one morning. Ozzy, still watching the window, nodded once. They're not waiting anymore. His final public appearance was brief, a tribute show. He didn't sing. He sat on stage beside a grand piano, eyes damp, hands folded. When the crowd erupted into applause, he stood slowly, bowed once, and said, "Thank you for waiting. I know it took me a while to get here." They didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. In private, he began speaking of peace, not a heavenly afterlife or divine reward. Just stillness, the absence of noise, a place beyond tours, contracts, needles, spotlights. A place where the voice inside him no longer had to perform, where silence was not frightening, but kind. He started sleeping without the light on. He asked Sharon to remove the cross from his bedside, not out of anger, just readiness. And then, one morning, he sat in his armchair, looking out the window. The birds sang. The sky turned orange. A cup of tea went cold in his hand. His eyes never closed, but something left. Sharon found him that way, still upright, still warm, still Ozzy, but gone. They say death is a door, but maybe, for Ozzy Osbourne, death was a mirror, and when he finally saw his full reflection, he recognized it, not as an ending, but as a reunion, with the voice, with the boy from Birmingham, with the silence that had been waiting all along.